Hey everyone, Sleepy Reader here. This is Sleepy Vlog number 80. And have you watched all 79 before? I think I started them fairly early on in my channel's history, inspired by a comic book mom. So maybe back in early 2012 or something like that, late 2011. Comic book mom, I'm still sad that you're not out there on YouTube anymore. I think probably she was driven off by trolls, but I'm not sure. Or maybe she kind of gave up on collecting comics so much, because I think near the end, before she disappeared, she was doing videos about other things. And that reminds me that just this week, GhostCritic, one of the people that was there when I started and I kind of looked up to, said he's either taking time off or he's quitting. He doesn't know if he's going to stop reading comics or stop making videos, but he's taking time off for sure. And his views have gone way down. And, he used to be, the number of views that any of us used to get were not huge, but he used to be someone who I remember thinking he was one of the people who got amongst the most views of the people in the small little comic book community. But, back then it was maybe, when I joined, 50 to 70 people making videos, and many of them not so frequently. And now it's just scattered all over the place. And I listening to him, I thought briefly, I had some of the same feelings he did. I actually occasionally think about imagine myself stopping to read comics, but then it's always, I'm not going to stop. I sometimes think about switching to all trades. Sometimes I'll read people pointing out the advantages of going all digital, and I'll say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's easy just to keep it all on the iPad and have no storage problems. But I don't think I'm really going to do that either. Going all trades or going a lot more trades seems the most likely route that I might someday take. But at the moment, I'm having a lot of fun just buying comics every week. I do like that pattern of the weekly serial of comics. Unlike Ghost, part of me always wished I was a bit more like GhostCritic, who very regularly put out videos on the same day each week on the same format. But maybe I had to keep myself from getting tired from it. But, my rules of doing these videos is, 1, don't monetize. Don't worry about the numbers. 2, giant finger. Have a giant finger. 2, do it when you want to do it. Do it when you have free time. Don't force it into your schedule. Don't feel obligated. And my other thing is stay in contact with people, comment on videos you watch. Now, that was easier for me when I used to listen to videos at my job, and I was at a typewriter or at a keyboard, and I could type in a quick comment really easily. It's a little harder to comment now that most of the time I'm listening to videos now is when I'm doing chores around the house or something. That is harder to comment. So I've got to focus on that, because what I want is comments myself. So it would be hypocritical not to leave comments. And not all the people that I comment on a lot ever comment on my videos, but I think it does come back around at times. Another thing, I think, I'm sort of now giving advice that it doesn't apply to GhostCritic, but if you're just starting out doing videos, I would not do too many videos all at once. I see people doing that, and I worry they're going to burn out before they even find their little audience, their little clique. Not to pick on you, but Gregor Black puts out a lot of videos. I don't think a lot of people have found him. Another good thing about commenting on other people's videos is it's one way for other people watching those videos to discover you. Like if they scroll down and see your comment, they say, I wonder who this person is. Do they have a channel too? And click on them. But although do not make your comments, hey, I've got a channel too, subscribe to me. Or at least I don't think you should do that. doesn't start you off on a good foot. And that reminds me, so I really, I wish the best to Mark, and I hope he has the urge to make more videos. But maybe I have the same complaint about him about YouTube becoming more negative. The YouTube comic book space having a larger negativity, and those people getting a lot of views. But I also, and I can see how it's frustrating as the views go down. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. Not just the negativity, but more or just as much the what you want to call it, the proliferation of so many channels. I subscribe to way more channels than I really can watch on a regular basis, because I don't want to miss out, but then I can't actually watch them all. And so all of us, although there are certain people, like for me, GhostCritic, I always watched his videos, at least his haul and his review videos. For most of us, there's only so many we can watch. So it's diluted in terms of viewers. So that's why I kind of try to focus on commenting, both giving and receiving comments. And this will be like other recent vlogs where I'm going to interact with the comments from the previous vlog. And if you have any questions, like you want to stir up trouble or whatever, leave questions down below for me, or just questions about me and my comic book reading, collecting, thoughts, hypotheses, fantasies. So I will continue for the foreseeable future to focus a lot on the comments and questions in my so-called sleepy vlogs. The whole channel is a vlog of my reading experiences. And so, maybe I wanted to emphasize a little more that the reason why I'm not feeling like I'm burnt out is because I just do it when I want to. And I don't feel too bad if I go 2 weeks without doing a video, 3 weeks, or do different kinds of videos at different times. Right now I'm doing a lot of sleepy vlogs. Other times I don't do any. Hauls when I feel like it. Sometimes I'm hauling comics and I don't feel like showing them. So it's just, there's no method to my madness. I'd love to do like consistent my thoughts on comics every week for the week of comics that come out, the way GhostCritic did. But it just doesn't work out that way, and I'm not going to force it to happen. Maybe someday it will. And as long as I enjoy doing it that way, that'll be good. I think there is a sense of accomplishment of putting out videos, even though videos I do totally lazy, no editing or nothing fancy. But it's, same kind of accomplishment you get of filling out your diary every day or something like that. So that's the only time I feel a little pressure of, hey, I've skipped my diary for too many weeks or something. So along those lines, I want to go back or continue to highlight people that I think I particularly like, new and old, people with channels. Just pick a few each sleepy vlog. So I wanted to mention Walt's Comics and Books. I think he gets plenty of views, so it's not about that, but just a reminder to everyone, he's out there, a guy in Germany, reading comics in English, talking about comics in English, doing a great job of it. He's very honest and can be quite critical and can be quite in love with some comics. So great guy to watch. He also is venturing into the kind of booktube space and talking about books here and there, which I also find interesting. Although the few booktubers I follow are ones who also talk about graphic novels, generally. And then I was really excited to see David Lee back. And you may or may not remember David Lee if you've been watching the YouTube comic book community for 6 or 7 years. But a while back, I think he stopped 3 or 4 years ago. He was doing videos quite regularly, usually talking about single issues. I think he called it the Comic Book Fix, and he does sometimes call his videos Comic Book Fix now. I don't think he's getting very many views because he's just started back up and it's been so long. Love his enthusiasm. Seems like a great guy. And yeah, so I'll put links to all of these guys below. Also wanted to just salute comicKkrakK, who has been on here almost as long as I have, and has been, like me, I think, just doing it when it makes sense and not doing it when it doesn't, sort of in and out of active video making. But he's very much in now, and I love his eclecticness. He'll talk about other interests like music and movies and board games, but he always comes back to comics. But it's never what everyone else is talking about comics. It's his own thing, whether it's underground comics or some obscure artist who used to do a lot of those Bronze Age mystery stories. That was his most recent video. And then, talking about channels that become popular because they're negative, there's a channel that's becoming quite popular. I don't know how big he'll get, but he's become very popular very fast with being totally positive, and that's Comics with Bueller, who's a fellow who lives around here. I chatted with him, with Travis, at the convention recently, and I hoping to find some free time to say, hey, can I buy you a coffee? But anyway, Comics with Bueller, I don't know how to characterize his channel. He does a lot of shows every week, maybe 3, 4, and most of them are pretty lengthy. But it's fun to. So I don't watch every single one every single time, but I always enjoy it when I do. Most fun is catching him live. He obviously has some time on his hands to do all those videos because some of them look like they have a lot of time put into them too. And actually, through Comics with Bueller, I discovered John's Comics with Kids, and sometimes he has his daughters on talking about comics they read. He also talks about his own comics reading a lot of the time, and seems to be mostly a Marvel fan, I think. Not entirely. And through John's Comics with Kids, I just recently discovered White Whale Comics, who's going to be having a group video. People will send him videos, and I guess he'll edit it together. I'll link to that below. I think I might do that myself, even though he probably doesn't know yet that I exist. Funny to think that I was once called a pillar of the community, and now there's whole portions of the community that don't know I exist. So yeah, that's stuff I wanted to highlight YouTube-wise. So let's see. What was I going to say? Well, I know what I was going to say, but I wanted to reiterate how much I liked My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies. And it's one of those comics that I thought about it more after I read it and liked it even more. And I can't remember, on someone's channel or podcast was saying it was probably a podcast saying this was not a good one. I think in the Criminal series, I think it's a very good one. It is part of Criminal, even though it doesn't say on the cover. On the inside, it says a criminal novella by Brubaker and Sean Phillips. I don't know if the coloring, if the art itself may be a little less ink heavy, and the coloring is kind of a lighter kind of thing. And you might take this as kind of a lighter story about this girl who takes the idea of addiction very lightly, but it completely gets turned on its head by the end of the story, and it really is a very dark story. And the more you think about it, the darker it really is. And while it might seem at first almost a positive story about addiction, it's really all about how the addicts have themselves totally fooled, and in the case of these addicts anyway, are really on a dark path, our heroine. And I also throughout, though, marveled at reading it, just a simple conversation is always very interesting. I was kind of riveted by a comic that was a series of conversations, and there's some magic in there, and it works visually and everything like that. It's not like one of those talking heads kind of comics where you feel like, well, the artist isn't really doing anything. So anyway, yeah, almost like a touch of Raymond Carver or something like that mixed in with the melodrama and the seediness. The seediness at a lower level of seediness than you would find in a Raymond Carver story. So another thing that I'm still listening to podcasts, maybe at a different pace than when I was commuting in my car, but I was listening to this podcast, what's it called, Off Panel, and they had on there's this owner of the Comics Experience in San Francisco who writes a lot of articles and goes on a lot of podcasts and talks about the business of comics from the retail point of view. His name is Brian Hibbs. And there was a lot of negative stuff in there, but he's always very negative and dour in a way, always kind of wanting to point out the problems. But he did kind of echo my own feeling about, maybe I always thought it was just Marvel, but he was saying the big two might be both looking for a way out of the direct market or planning the next step on the assumption the direct market's going away. And most alarmingly to me, he thinks that DC is now beginning to act more like Marvel in terms of the odd tricks that they play on the direct market and the kind of, poor... I still see the pricing difference between DC and Marvel as very different from what I've seen, but the poor labeling of events he was talking about. And so I guess he thinks that he's postulating, I think, that the new management at the top of DC, beyond those three people we always see, Lee and DiDio and Jeff Johns, that, like there's a new woman president of it, replacing the previous woman president. Anyway, and that tied in with kind of the events that happened with Batman Damned, where once it got in the news that Batman's PP was in here, that new president of DC said, we've got to take it out. And it was announced that it'll never be reprinted, those two panels with his wee hanging out. And you'll never... And Brian Hibbs seemed to think there's a possibility they may not even continue publishing this, or it may go straight to trade, or something else may happen, and that the whole fate of the DC Black Label is in danger, which makes me really sad. Just as a reader, I really enjoyed Batman Damned. It was beautiful. It was a cool little side take on Batman with a much more supernatural angle than usual. That I really, really enjoyed. I enjoyed the different take on Dead Man and the appearance of Zatanna and other things. So, and I've been looking forward to the Black Label. And so anyway, this idea, that's what depressed me most about that interview with Hibbs. But there's a lot of information. Another thing that he said is at his shop, the biggest selling stuff is kids stuff, the kids' graphic novels, far outselling any of the adult stuff. So on one hand, people who bemoan that kids aren't reading comics maybe shouldn't be bemoaning that, but those who want our stuff to stay successful, the stuff that we older guys and gals like, that's more up in the air maybe still. At least judging from that podcast, because I was feeling pretty optimistic just recently. And part of my optimism has been all these different projects that DC's doing that look good to me and look like DC's looking for ways to, keep that side of things alive, that superhero side of things alive in a lot of different formats. But from the point of view of these giant corporations where the money's made from movies and toys and T-shirts, if they decide they need to line up what's going on in comics with the toys and T-shirts, then we as readers are in trouble, unfortunately. Now, fortunately, there's lots of other stuff to read, as long as the comic shops don't go out of business. Another thing that Hibbs said was that he thinks a lot of, because comic shops aren't high money-making things, a lot of people who are in the business of doing comic shops are doing it because they love superheroes. So if superheroes go down, their own motivation for keeping these shops going, even if it's kids' stuff selling really well or whatever, or indie comics, they might not be as motivated. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I think a lot of the shop owners might be more part of what we could call the image generation in terms of Walking Dead and Saga and that kind of thing. I certainly, was talking about Saga with my store owner, and he reads it and likes it. and there's another store down the street that's clearly opened mostly in response to kind of the indie and kids book kind of thing. But they like Marvel Comics too, and they carry those. Anyway, so now let me move on to comments from the last video, and there were a lot of comments on one specific subject, which was my impression that some people in the sort of more extreme indie end of things dislike Robert Crumb and kind of want him to be pushed out of the conversation, at least in terms of the kind of comics they do. And, and I don't know how big this movement is, but anyway, I found out about it and I talked about it and I got a lot of cool comments about it. So I'm going to start with those comments, read those to you, and make a few comments of my own as I go along. So Reader1717, our good friend up in Canada, Cami, wrote, "Hi, Damien. I agree with you regarding Robert Crumb. He's a very dislikable individual, and I don't care for him personally. However, I do appreciate his work. I have some issues with his work towards women and minorities, but I don't know if he needs to be erased from comic book history. I would go as far as to say that if we do that, there are many more mainstream artists and writers who could get named." So kind of a snowball effect of how much history do you want to erase. M. Duffy wrote, "Sad to hear about Crumb. I can understand being turned off by his work, but one should acknowledge his artistic merit and his impact on underground comics." Yeah, if nothing else, just on the way to publish underground comics, since he published the first, successful underground comic, Zap, and got the role of the distribution system and everything. He was out there just selling it on the street before he found he could sell it at head shops and that kind of thing. Have you read this is still M. Duffy, have you read his adaptation of the book of Genesis? I have not, but heard it's really good and fairly faithful to the source material. And I've looked through it. I got it out of the library once, and I didn't read it. I should get it out of the library again, or maybe buy it. It looked really good, but I wasn't in the mood at the time to read Genesis, which I assume is full of a lot of repetitive kind of stuff, along with the major stories. Max Washington Songs wrote, "I agree about Crumb and other creators. I read some very off-putting things about John Lennon and Bob Dylan, but they're human, like we all are, not perfect." And that's a very good point. Many people's lives, if you really examine them, can bring up things, that would make it hard for them to get elected president, for instance. And it kind of depends on who you ask what bad things you'll hear about someone, like their ex-girlfriend or something. Pope Cerebus I wrote, "Genesis by Crumb was astounding. If newer generation people feel like erasing Crumb, I fear they've chosen to deny that certain emotions and opinions exist among humans. Much of Crumb's work was a manifestation of joy, anger, perversion, and confusion within the human psyche. Truly glorious ideas and a searing peek into the human mind via art." And art, one of the great things art does is take us into those weird corners that are hard to describe or hard to understand, but they're there in the human mind, in the human heart. Now, I always do feel like underneath it all, art also has kind of a moral obligation of a sort. Art that just creates serial killers, for instance, might not be good art, or might be art that just, should be rethought. But I'm not saying that Crumb is creating serial killers. U2099 wrote, R.E. Crumb never really experienced his work, but that documentary was unforgettable and a little disturbing, particularly in its depiction of his family. I forget most movies, but not that one. Too bad the sisters declined to contribute. His sisters did not appear or were not even talked about in the movie, but probably wise on their part. The dysfunction in that house must have been off the charts. I do feel like Crumb will live on in particular because a very good documentary was made about him that made him interesting and odd and strange and compelling. And it's really, in my mind, after that movie that he started appearing in The New Yorker, and much more prominent reprints of his books in America started coming out. Vincenzo C. wrote, and puts this very well, I reserve the right to welcome and learn from Crumb's honesty without being responsible for everything he says. And yes, that's an important thing about art, I think. And maybe that's something more of an older generation's view of art than the current generation, or some subset of a current generation's view of art. But there may be other things going on. I don't want to miscategorize what the group of people who want to downgrade Crumb are really on about. But this is all of our reactions to it. Paulo Costa wrote, Crumb may lose his relevance in the future, but that happens organically if new generations stop finding historical figures or events important to them. I can't approve of airbrushing figures out of history because of other things they did, and it's impossible to have a history that's entirely made up of morally irreprehensible. So people who are not reprehensible. Genghis Khan killed thousands of people, but he had an interesting life worthy of study. And Washington, our founding father of the United States, had slaves. Back to what Paulo wrote, Gauguin abandoned his wife and daughter in order to move to Tahiti to reinvent himself. And Crumb had weird sex fetishes. Fine. But what is it that attracted people to them? That is what's important to know. Certainly important, yes, to know that. Maybe important to know their strengths and their weaknesses, I suppose. Especially when you're talking about historic figures, you don't want to only talk about Genghis Khan's good side. Edward2962 wrote, I'll say that Crumb is probably one of the most important figures in comics history. But yeah, his work was definitely controversial. Even back in the day, other cartoonists like Trina Robbins called him out for his sexism. And then there's his racial humor. I'm glad I read his 80s stuff first, then read his interviews, and then worked back to his 60s comics. If I'd started with the 60s stuff, I probably would have been put off. Interestingly enough, the first Crumb strip I ever saw was Meatball, reprinted in Comics by Les Daniels, which was ironically pretty tame. I think Comics was a book about the underground comics movement. And maybe Les Daniels felt he was limited by his own publisher, or maybe not. I don't know what percentage of Crumb's stuff really is the extreme ultra stuff and how much of it is really other kinds of things, which are not so offensive. Gore Vidal wrote, Good day. The Crumb story stunned me. I suspect novelists and filmmakers from different generations will suffer the same fate. I don't know why it has become difficult for people to put works of art in context to time and place, and to be interested in something that isn't about them, and to separate the art from the creator. We all understood that growing up. It wasn't difficult to do, and it wasn't personal. Will Scorsese's 70s films be booed one day? Hemingway's personal life is notorious. We all know it. But will he be booed at a book award when his name is mentioned? Will Fellini, Godard, Buñuel, Bergman suffer the same fate one day too? I think Hemingway's already been kind of downgraded in the academic world. I'm not positive on that. I loved reading Hemingway back in my time of reading him. But, there's a good point about context. You can't read anything from the past unless you're willing to do a context with it. Things just change. But the positions of things, the way of viewing things, the way of talking about things, what is acceptable, what isn't. Infrared Media, Brian wrote, I did watch part of the Crumb documentary. He came off as a very weird person, but most artistically inclined people are. I agree with you about how it's okay to love and hate the guy, but he shouldn't be erased from history. Anyway, I'll try to watch more later. Take care and God bless. Thanks, Brian. I used to want to believe that was like some kind of myth about how out there creative people are, but I think there's very few creative people who are just like your average middle-class person. They just aren't. Or your average nice person. They often just aren't nice people if they're really driven to pursue their own visions. Okay, and I'll continue on. It's 31 minutes already. Jeremy Klein wrote a question. He's the only one who wrote a question this time, but I encourage more questions. He says, what do you know of Ahoy Comics? I'm reading they're putting out comic book magazines with backup features and even text stories. So they're calling them magazines, but they still look like I don't have an Ahoy comic in front of me, but they're still a regular-sized comic. And what they have is they have the regular comic, which I think is 20 pages long or 22 pages long. And then in the back, they usually have another like 2-page, more comic strip-like comic in the two that I've read so far, both of which I liked a lot. But I'm having trouble finding them, getting more. I've asked my comic shop to get them now. Kind of depended on wanting to sample them from picking them up from some shop in my neighborhood with so many shops in my neighborhood. But anyway, so they have that comic strip thing, and then they've usually had an interview with a creator or an editor, and then a 2-page text fiction so far in the 2 issues I've seen by Grant Morrison himself. But, just trying, I was kind of turned off by the Grant Morrison fictions, not for any particular reason. They just didn't immediately suck me in. There's something about the art of the short story you really should, your first paragraph should make you want to read the rest. And since when you're in a comic book mode, it's hard to switch to a text mode anyway, but I'll go back and try to read those Morrison things. So I think their idea of a magazine thing is every issue has multiple stuff going on, like a regular magazine has multiple articles or something like that. Whether that matters, they're still good comics. It's kind of nice that they're going to the effort to put bonus material in there. So I appreciate that about them. Both of the ones I've read, Wrong Earth and Higher Heaven, they're kind of humorous, and they're both written by Tom Payer, who's also an editor at Ahoy. I'm trying to get a hold of Captain Scarlet or Captain Ginger about a cat in a future where there are no humans and cats have taken over. But I have not found that yet, and I don't think that's written by their editor. So we'll see. Gore Vidal wrote, I think my generation was the last one where comics were part of our childhood, a big part of our childhood, I think he might have meant, or just a part of our childhood. They were everywhere and cheap. They were also fun, part of our visual and intellectual entertainment, like TV and film. Now, all 3 of these mediums detract from reading books, but we still at least read. Since then, cable television, and for me, reading comics and reading science fiction were very linked, and science fiction and fantasy, I mean, like reading Conan and reading Conan novels really went together. And I felt like the people who wrote comics back then read a lot of the books that I read. Now I don't feel like the people reading comics read books so much as they watch TV. But anyway, so he says, now all Since then, cable television and 100 channels, the growth of video games, and now the internet and social media have replaced comics as the intellectual and visual entertainment among the current generation. The comics are expensive, but that isn't the reason young people aren't reading them. They don't read, meaning they don't read and buy books beyond what they had to read in school or university. They didn't grow up with comics being part of the culture. In the 90s, there was so much more visual entertainment that comics became largely irrelevant to a whole new generation. And I can't really argue with that, but, with the very current new generation of, 10-year-olds and 13-year-olds, with my nieces, my two youngest nieces, who are a little bit older than my daughter, do not read. My daughter does read. People at her school read a lot. And certainly graphic novels are out there quite a bit for those who do read, in the libraries, in the bookstores, and all of that. But overall, I think I'm afraid you're right. Celia wrote, reading childhood favorites can be quite daunting, but I'm often surprised by how many of them that have stood the test of time. And sometimes nostalgia is what we need. Yeah, that's certainly true with books, Celia. I'm not sure with comics. Some of them really do stand up, actually. Like, for me, Commandy really stands up. But like those Captain Marvels by Jim Starlin that I was reading, they don't stand up quite so well. Paulo Costa wrote, I always wonder why people complain about trades. Sure, they are expensive for a single item, but I don't know if people understand the economics. When I buy a European album, and Paulo lives in Portugal, when I buy a European album, it costs the equivalent of $17 or $20, with 48 to 64 pages, which is expensive. There are things in European comics that mitigate the high price per page, perhaps the time taken on the pages and the bigger pages with more panels. But they don't come out every month. You can wait about 6 months, but wait between 6 months and 3 years for the next installment of a series. And in between, the writer and artist may even work on something completely different with other creators. Fans of independent comics might be willing to wait for the next book, but how would superhero fans react if they were told they had to wait 8 months for another Spider-Man adventure? Yeah, it's going to be a different world if we go purely to trades, in a lot of different ways, I think. Although here the trades are quite economically feasible. I mean, you may pay, if you pay $20, you may be getting, 200 to 300 pages. But I guess we're lucky there, and maybe that's subsidized by the existence of the floppies. Paulo also wrote on a different subject, I think responding to a question from Edward about the so-called Portland Mafia in comics, which I don't think really exists, or at least, that there's no one Portland Mafia of comics. But Paulo wrote, I guess what makes some groups cliques nowadays is that a bunch of people get together in the same city's comic book scene. The first one to make it can help bring his fans in. But then when every professional had to work in New York, it was easier for everyone to know everyone else and to avoid closed groups. Also, you had to graduate by being an assistant to another artist, which is more about proving yourself and evolving as a new professional than about impressing people as a genius right from the first meeting. Well, it must have been cool when everyone could live in New York and afford to live in New York, although I think even back then it was kind of hard for people on a comics salary to do so. But it might have been even more cliquish in a way. And you might have had to get in with Neil Adams or get in with Rich Buckler to get in as an artist at the big two, which were the main game in town at the time. But in terms of Portland, I just reemphasize there's so many comic book artists and writers and companies here that I think there are, if there are cliques at all, there are multiple cliques. I don't think Ron Randall is in the same clique as Brian Michael Bendis, as Kelly Sue DeConnick, as Paul Galassi. I mean, they're just all over the place. And the founder, I guess, of the Portland comic scene would be Mike Richardson, who had a comic book store here and then started Dark Horse Comics. And that's the tip of the edge that led to everyone moving here. But it seems like half the comic book industry is here, so it may be pretty close to what New York was like back in the day. But with the internet and everything like that, we're never going to get a totally centralized scheme like that ever again. Unless the internet goes away. And this, I think, also is from Paulo. Oh, no, that was a reply from me. Samuel Trejo wrote, I think, okay, he was talking about if you're not into Marvel and DC yet, where's a good starting point? And he wrote, I think Marvel Now was a great jumping on point for new readers. I don't know if you can still figure out where Marvel Now was, like if you're buying trades, maybe. Certainly in the boxes, in the cheap boxes or something, if you're looking at old Marvel comics from 5 or 6 years ago. I think Marvel Now was a great jumping on point for new readers, Samuel writes. It was for me, new Iron Fist, new Punisher, new Daredevil, and so many more new starting points, all with cool new artists and fun writing. It reminded me of DC's New 52 with its character reinvention. Reinventing is also a drawback since you end up getting so much of the same character over and over again. Yeah, so if you're already familiar with the characters, all these reboots can feel very repetitive after a point because you keep going back to the beginning and cover the basics. Independent and creator-owned books have the advantage there since you can always see a closer beginning and conclusion to a character and his story. Max Washington wrote, I think in terms of, how do comic book stores make their money and will they stay in business? He wrote, Midtown Comics probably needs all the toys and shirts to pay their high Manhattan rent. I want to find out how much of their profit comes from floppies. Probably a small percentage. The upper level is filled with toys, etc. I hope the floppies don't disappear. I'm guessing the higher rent area a comic book store is in, the more it needs to sell the tchotchkes and other stuff that may sell, bring in a different audience or sell to a different audience than the core audience. And the cheaper the rents, the more grungy, down home, just the floppies kind of comic book stores you could have. Be interesting as Portland's rents just keep going up and up. What's going to happen to the 12 plus comic book stores around here? Are they all going to continue? Some of them surely will be driven out by higher rents. I know that is somewhat of an issue for my comic book store. Reader 1717 wrote, if I stop buying comics, it will be because it has become too rich for my blood. I absolutely love my comics, and that would be a terrible way to come to an end of a lifetime journey. But I'm not holding my breath that the day is coming, for me at least. I love movies, and I could spend $3 on a DVD or even a Blu-ray and know that I will go back to watch those movies over and over again. So obviously buying a cheap Blu-ray or DVD is a very good investment because you can watch it multiple times for that small amount of money. And even for the one time, it takes you longer to watch a movie than to read a $3 or $4 comic, right? She says, as for now, I'm still in the game, but I am very careful before I part with my hard-earned cash. It is an expense, and it is more than a lot of other forms of entertainment in terms of, time you get out of it per hour, per dollar. It kind of depends on how you compare it to. Like if I compare it to taking my family out for dinner, a dinner that lasts 45 minutes or an hour, to the amount of time it takes me to read $30 or $40 worth of comics that I bought, which I get, a 25% discount off. So I can get, let's say, 10 comics for $30. Then, it depends what you compare it to, is what I'm saying. So you can compare it to like the cost of a Starbucks coffee, or you can compare it to something else. It's my daughter's phone ringing in the background. Well, not really her phone, but our emergency phone for her. So no one should be calling that. Okay, that's the end of the comments. And I'm very distracted by the sound of that ringing phone. So, the phone stopped ringing. Well, so I have some more comments that are from another video I did. I just thought a few of them were interesting. Walt from Walt's Comics and Books wrote, pretty sure the reason for Bright Riser not being part of this GN, the graphic novel, this one, the My Heroes Are All Junkies, is because her husband's affiliation with Comicsgate, though she is repeatedly stated of being apolitical and not wanting to choose any sides in this whole stupid culture war. Big fan of hers, and not seeing her talent on mainstream books anymore makes me sad. And also disgusted at the people who assume guilt by association is a perfectly moral thing to do. And if that's the case, I agree with you, Walt. I mean, I really will miss her colors, and I think it's a silly thing to hurt her career over. I still think it's all really about diversity in comics and his whole approach to personally attacking people and giving the impression, rightly or wrongly, that he's spearheading people being trolls and intimidators. And that's what people are striking out against. But then it's like this fire that keeps burning more and more houses and sucking more and more people into the conflagration. It's very ugly stuff. Jared Osborne wrote, keep in mind he was talking about Crumb covers, because I made a comment about Crumb covers and how I liked the new ones a lot better than the ones in the 90s. And he wrote, keep in mind most of the 90s specialty covers were done without the benefit of a computer. John Romita would have to draw a sketch of which areas were to be embossed, have fifth color inks or shiny paper, and then the printer would use that as a guide to set out how things would print. Nowadays, it can all be set up as a digital file in Photoshop. A lot more precision, and you don't have to depend on a printer's interpretation. I think DC has been doing a good job with those specialty covers. I've even noticed them embossing the cross-hatching on some of the art. You couldn't do that in the early 90s. So it is pretty amazing what a program like Photoshop allows publishing to do. It can sometimes ruin things, but yeah, mostly it's been for the good. And I wrote him back. It's amazing what computers allow them to do these days. Did people on staff back in the day like the Crumb covers? I asked Jared, and Jared wrote back, there wasn't a lot of love for them. Almost everybody knew it was a short-term gimmick that would backfire in the long run. But it was making money, so no one in power wanted to stop it. So yeah, the people in power and their short-term view of things. Now, it's funny, on those Crumb books, I think there are people who were kids when those came out, and now they are nostalgic about them and are delighted as they find shiny chrome 90s books in the 50-cent bin and that kind of thing. Well, I'm going to head off. If you've made it all the way to the 48-minute plus mark here, write down 666 in a comment if you have the time, and that'll amuse me. Talk to you all later. Bye-bye.